Hello everyone, welcome to the Roundtable. As always, it was a busy week in a rapid changing world. Especially it is because year 2024 is indeed year of election, with some 50 countries holding elections. Here in the studio, we are joined by two experts who will share their insightful views on global affairs. We have Dr. Park Won-kwon, a professor of North Korean Studies at Ewha Womans University, and Dr. Kim Hena, Professor of International Studies at Seogang University. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, I'm glad to join one more time.
Thanks for having me again.
Today we are presenting part 3 of our New Year special. We are going to talk about the high-stakes presidential election of Taiwan, which was held on Saturday. It was a tight race between a pro-independence candidate and pro-unification candidate. Professor Kim, for our viewers' information, would you tell us about who won the election and who the winner is?
So the current Vice President Lai Ching-te, or William Lai, was elected as the 16th president of Taiwan, and he's part of the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP for short. And the interesting thing about him is that he has a lot of political experience. So he's not only the vice president, but he was the mayor of Tainan from 2010 to 2017. The interesting thing is that since his first electoral victory in 1996, he has won elections 9 times consecutively, which may indicate how he was able to win the elections this time as well.
I see. Well, two candidates were running neck and neck within the margin of error until the last minute, but the result might look very different from the prediction. So it was really difficult to predict who would win until the election day. First, let's talk about the accounts of this outcome. Professor Park, could you analyze the outcome of the election first?
Well, I think it's a very interesting election, the result, because even though this DPP candidate, Lai Ching-te, won the election, but he barely got the more than 40%. The reason I use the word barely is compared to his predecessor, Tsai. She's actually very conveniently won the election, more than 50%. In other words, the two other candidates, they got the 60%. So I think it's the result of this voting rate clearly mentioning something. That is the overall the Taiwanese, they wanted to maintain status quo. We all know that the Lai Ching-te is the very pro-independent figure. And even though all the campaign period, he didn't mention very actively or proactively about the independence of Taiwan, but Taiwanese all know that he's pro-independent figure. So overall Taiwanese, 60% means that they wanted to simply maintain status quo, and they do not want to have any serious conflict with China. So it turned out in that figures. And also the legislative election is another very important thing. And DPP is failed to get the majority. The other two parties get the majority. So it's another sign and message from the Taiwanese people too.
I see.
Yeah, in addition to what Professor Park said, I completely agree, because the presidential and parliamentary elections were held concurrently. And even though Lai and the DPP won the presidential elections, the ruling party failed to retain legislative majority despite winning the presidential race. So I think that speaks to how close the election was to a certain extent. But also, as Professor Park mentioned, I think this election was very unique because it was the first election in Taiwan where 3 parties were part of the elections. And it was since 2000, the ruling party has changed every 8 years, but this is the first time the DPP won 3 elections in a row. So in many ways, it's very interesting.
So DPP ruling will last at least 12 years.
Right, at least 12 years.
But still, I think the most important factor is China, because around the election, China gave a so-called coercive diplomacy against Taiwan. They have the military exercise, that they sent their fighter jets and all those things, and make the Taiwanese people to alert about their own national security. So I think even though China definitely wanted to win this Guo Mintang KMT's candidate, but it turned out that exactly opposite result.
I see. The latest presidential election was crucial as it was considered an occasion to measure Taiwanese voters' attitude toward China and unification. According to a survey conducted by Taiwan's National Cheng-te University last year, the number of respondents identifying themselves as Chinese dropped to a record low of 2.5%. By contrast, 62.8% regarded themselves as Taiwanese. The election of Lai Ching-te shows Taiwan's people cast their ballots based upon these perceptions. It is expected the election result will bring considerable changes to relation between Taiwan and China across the strait. Professor Park, what will happen to the cross-strait relations in the aftermath of the election?
Yes, we have to see, especially the Lai, the winner, and what kind of a policy he's going to do is one of the most important factors. And I already mentioned that even though he didn't put much emphasis on the independence of Taiwan, but if he inaugurates and he's turning to the very pro-independent policies, that it definitely can bring the very serious conflict between Taiwan and China. And another thing is that how China responds to the election. I think May is the month that starts the new administration. So I think before the May, China will have this kind of coercive diplomacy to Taiwan to give some very clear message and sign. So those time of period is very important in terms of stability of Taiwan Strait.
Well, I pay attention to the reflection about demographic change in Taiwan society, as the survey results clearly show that more and more Taiwanese identify themselves not Chinese, but Taiwanese. That means that they would strongly prefer status quo and peaceful relations across the Taiwan Strait based upon pragmatic pursuit of mutual interest. But at the same time, they are gravitated toward the voice of Taiwan's independence from the mainland China. But we have to be really careful in diversifying the package of these results, because well, I identify as Taiwanese, not Chinese. Does that necessarily mean that these Taiwanese will do everything and make every sacrifice to support official declaration of Taiwan's independence from mainland China? They just want to be free from the influence of mainland.
Yes, I agree with that. Especially the China's MZ generation. They are not much interested in the independence of the political things. Rather, they are interested in their daily life, like the economic development and getting the job and everything. So I think this kind of their opinion reflect this election. So that's why I mentioned that 60% of the Taiwan people do not vote for the Lai.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you. And we mentioned this during the first New Year special as well, about the declining political interest among younger people. But I think from the context of China, I think China is still very wary of Lai, and there is still very cautious of Lai's victory. As Professor Park mentioned earlier, Lai didn't specifically state that he would pursue independence. He has stated that he wants to maintain the status quo. But after Lai was elected, the statement on the Chinese side was that the election results will not influence the foundation or direction of cross-strait relations. And they have also mentioned that there's going to be potential reunification. So in many ways, China still seems very cautious.
Other countries in the region were closely watching the election. They are now busy assessing what the result means. Professor Kim, what is so special about Taiwanese election for these countries?
I think in part it's because this election can bring about significant geopolitical changes to the Asia-Pacific region. So in Northeast Asia, for example, there are numerous ships that pass through the Taiwan Strait. And in the case of South Korea, around 45% of its imports and exports and 80% of its oil exports from the Middle East go through the strait. So if anything were to happen in the strait and there's trouble there, then this would not only disrupt the main sea route in that area, but it would also deal a severe blow to the transportation of resources and products. And as a result of that, people are watching very carefully and keeping an eye out on what's going to happen in the future related to this.
Bloomberg Economics published an analysis predicting that China's invasion of Taiwan would cost the world economy $10 trillion or about 10% of global GDP. It forecasts that Korea, the US, and Japan would also take a hit from a war over Taiwan. In particular, Korea could see more than 20% shaved off its GDP, suffering the second largest damage after Taiwan, one of the warring parties. Professor Park, what direct impact will I don't want to think about this, but if there will be a military conflict on the Taiwan Strait.
Well, we may have a chance to talk about military conflict later, but I don't think there is a high chance that the military conflict or the real serious military confrontation in the Taiwan Strait in the foreseeable future. But it is important to point out that this election makes such a huge impact all over the world, and also the South Korea was not the exception at all. First of all, you see about the economic side, because the United States has tried to adjust so-called supply chain, especially we have already said chief for the alliance is the semiconductor, the leading countries such as, of course, Taiwan, South Korea, United States, Japan. If KMP, Kuomintang's the candidate won the election, it's going to be a little bit difficult time because they are pro-China figure. The Lai won the election means that it's continued to have this kind of supply chain, especially the semiconductor, to lead by this four country. Of course, the United States definitely wanted to exclude China in this kind of circle. So I think it's going to give us some advantage and also at the same time disadvantage to South Korea. That's one thing. And the other is that about the security issue and political issue, South Korea should have a more like a balancing act. We are seeing the possible kind of a confrontation between Taiwan and China, and then probably South Korea is kind of forced to get the side with which side you are going to take, like Taiwan or China. It's a more challenging for the South Korea's political and security issue.
I see. Professor Kim, it's been a while that the Biden administration launched these initiatives to create the Chip 4, so-called Semiconductor Alliance among the like-minded countries. But what's going to happen to Chip 4 after Taiwan's election?
So, as Professor Park mentioned earlier, the Chip 4 is President Biden initiated. So there are many other things to take into account. There are many variables here, one being the U.S. elections that are going to be taking place, since President Biden is the one who initially proposed this, in order to seek stronger decoupling away from China in terms of the semiconductor industry. So we can imagine that if there's going to be a bit of a reconfiguration of the semiconductor industry, especially if Lai is president and U.S. China relations continue to grow more tense, and especially if the U.S. wants more of or is seeking more of a decoupling away from China.
Professor Bao, I'd like to ask you the basic question to clarify the main issues here. Why Taiwan important to both United States and China?
Well, there are several very important reasons. For the United States, definitely Taiwan is one of the leading countries in the semiconductor. I mean, technologically, the semiconductor is the most important material and the product at this moment. So definitely need for the Taiwanese cooperation to readjust the supply chain of a semiconductor. And second one is that we already know that China is trying to expand the defense parameter, so-called first chain, and then it's definitely including Taiwan. So if Taiwan is more like the pro-China, it's more complicated for United States to have their security and the strategy. So that's the second reason. For China, you see, China's the most vital interest is to reunification about the China. Of course, it means that they definitely wanted to bring Taiwan into the territories that they have said that one China policy for past several decades. So if we are saying the possibility of the war or the military conflict in Taiwan Strait, I'm pretty clear that if Taiwan would decide to proclaim the independence, then I think China, no matter who's going to the leader of the China, no choice but to have a military option they have to utilize. So that's the very important vital interest for China.
I see. Professor Kim, prior to the Taiwan's presidential election, that both the United States and China tried to exert their own respective influence upon that.
Yeah, so I think both the U.S. and China have their own carrot and stick strategies. The U.S. is providing a carrot to Taiwan by providing arms sales and providing advanced weapons. But of course, the support is not unconditional. So they're providing the support, but they're also repeatedly stating and explicitly stating that they do not support independence. And in the case of China, China's also doing a similar strategy where they're providing airfare and trips to China at a more affordable price to Taiwanese people. But at the same time, they're also sending in fighters and reconnaissance balloons into the Taiwan Strait as a warning. So we can kind of see that they're using the same strategy, but in very different ways.
You see, the many liberal democratic countries, including South Korea, United States, we are kind of worried about so-called disinformation warfare by the China. But it turned out that actually China failed. They are just, Professor Kim mentioned, they tried their best, but not the very delicate, complicated way to make an influence on the Taiwanese elections. So it turned out that exactly opposite result that China has pursued.
So it is likely that the Xi Jinping government will go back to the drawing board and see what actually failed, what turned out to be counterproductive in terms of exerting influence upon Taiwanese voters' decision this time. In the past, the U.S.-China relations were also greatly different, as Professor Park mentioned, depending upon who took the in Taiwan. If it was the pro-independent Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, took power, or pro-unification Kuomintang, KMT. Professor Park, what's going to happen after this election, between Washington and Beijing relations?
Well, this year is a very important year for the relationship between the China and United States and China, because you see, we are seeing that the last November when President Biden has met Secretary Xi at the San Francisco. It turned out that finally the relationship between China and United States is like the stabilized. We are seeing that for past couple of weeks, there are various kind of communication channels.
Especially the military to
military. Yes, military to
right?
military. That's what the Biden administration has pursued for past several years. And they said that in order to have some kind of guardrail, in other words, not to entering the very serious conflict, including military conflict between United States and China, they have to have the guardrail. And they successfully have reopened the communication channel between these two militaries. And other than militaries, and of course there are other kind of levels, and they are started to resume the dialogue between these two countries. So I think this year, at least United States, China has maintained some kind of, or they managed the relationship. Because you see, the coming November, United States, they have an election. And of course, China, they have suffered about their economic difficulties. In other words, those two countries definitely do not want to have any kind of serious conflicts. I think it makes such a huge impact on the Taiwan issue too. So unless the Lai make a very proactive and very aggressive the kind of statement for their independence, and then try to maintain and manage the relationship with Taiwan and China. And of course, China and the United States, they share the same interest.
I see.
So what do you think about that?
Well, I try to make it cute. So I like to urge you and our viewers, in order to understand what's going to happen to Taiwan, you have to see not only Taiwan Strait, but you have to see Korean Peninsula. Because I would expect that there will be a very serious discussion and revision of the strategies related to the deployment and the mission of the United Nations U.S. forces stationed in South Korea as a potential swing force if there is a, God forbid, military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So if there is any serious discussion between Washington and Seoul about redefinition of the operation and mission of the U.S. forces stationing in South Korea, that says something about U.S. posture toward Taiwan after this election.
Actually, United States already made this Indo-Pacific is just one theater. It means that if something, the military conflict happened in this region, of course we are talking about possible Taiwan Strait conflict and of course emergency in the Korean Peninsula. The United States will utilize all the forward deployed forces, including U.S. forces in Korea for the Taiwan case. So what I urged for the past couple of years that South Korea and United States should prepare for this, of course, with Japan too, prepared all the possible contingencies in the Indo-Pacific
All the
region.
contingency scenarios.
So actually, the last year when we have a Camp David summit, and one of the agreement is to talk about this issue among the three countries, of course, United States, Japan, and South Korea.
Professor Kim, and what do you think that China and the United States, as well as other countries, tries to do in order to keep cooperation with new Taiwan leadership?
I think to a certain extent, because the same party is going to be in power and not that much is going to change, I think the U.S. will continue its long-standing position of supporting Taiwan but not supporting independence.
Okay.
To a certain extent, Taiwan is too important or strategically too important to the United States in terms of the U.S.-China strategic rivalry. So it will continue to provide support but not support unification. And in the case of China, in terms of its relationship to Taiwan, I think it'll continue its carrot and stick strategy. Many Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, have stated that they will not renounce the right to use force against Taiwan. But they've also stated that they want peaceful reunification. So to a certain extent, I think things will stay relatively the same, at least for the short-term future.
At least for the short term.
Right.
Chinese President Xi Jinping's third term will end in 2027. He needs new justification to extend his rule and stay in power for another 5 years. The biggest question is if China will use military forces to unify with Taiwan around that time. Professor Park, would you like to make further comments on this nightmare scenario?
Yeah, 2027 is very difficult to predict. But there are some, two possibilities about the possible military action by Xi Jinping. It depends on some kind of a nationalistic sentiment. You see, China has promoted this kind of a nationalism for past several decades, especially for consolidate their own one-party leadership. So they continue to that. And another factor is how the Chinese economy performed until 2027. If they performed well, and then they do not, CCP does not need to promote nationalism. But if they performed poorly and getting deteriorate the economy, they have to bring some kind of the outside tension for domestic purpose. Then it's a possibility to have some kind of military action. But at the same time, it's a very high cost. There is no guarantee that China would easily win and to take over the Taiwan because still the United States are showing their intention to protect Taiwan. And at the same time, we already briefly mentioned about the Japan and South Korea, other liberal democratic countries, not just simply step back and to see taking over by the China. So it's kind of very complicated issue. So I think the Beijing will have a calculation, benefit and cost. So that's another important factor.
I see. With the Taiwan election 2 weeks away, President of the United States, Joe Biden, signed the National Defense Authorization Act into law, which increases the defense budget by some 3%. China expressed its dissatisfaction with this change and criticized the Biden administration. Professor Kim?
Yeah, so I think that China believes that the U.S. was sending an indirect signal or message through this. From China's perspective, they think that the U.S. is sending an indirect message about any type of unprovoked Chinese act towards Taiwan or that the United States will act accordingly. So even though the U.S. often does provide some strategic ambiguity, if the U.S.'s security commitment towards Taiwan becomes clear or more transparent in this way, it can lead to many pro-independence people in Taiwan and allow them to pursue their political objectives, which is independence.
Which might embolden them, right?
Right. And I think China is quite concerned about what that kind of message will send to pro-independence people in Taiwan. And I think that's why they were worried and upset about this.
We have discussed the presidential election of Taiwan, which was the first nail-biter big election of this year, 2024. It presents a lot of variables for Korea in regard to national security, the economy, and of course the semiconductor business. So it is necessary and important for us here in South Korea to closely observe what changes Taiwan will undergo domestically and internationally in the aftermath of the election. Professor Park and Professor Kim, thank you so much for joining our program today.
Thank you.
Thank you.